Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again and welcome to episode 88 of this podcast series, and this time we're going to meet a pantomime director who's had an extensive career in both theatre and education.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
In the last episode, we met cast members from Imagine's pantos across the UK at the final photo shoot ahead of the new season. If you missed it, you can still check it out along with all of the other previous episodes. And so far we've had a variety of guests, from celebrities and backstage team members to practitioners and academics. We've discussed specific panto titles, talked about how pantomime is produced, its history and its future. Remember, you can check them out where you normally get your podcast from, and don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss any future episodes. So this time, we're going to meet the pantomime director who's had a successful and varied career in both the theatre and education. His lifelong interests in music hall, pantomime and variety began as a child, having seen many summer seasons in his hometown of Llandudno, and later numerous pantomimes at the Swansea Grand Theatre. He is David Lloyd-Jones. How are you, David?
I'm good, thank you, Martin. Good to speak to you.
So first of all, take us back to that childhood in Wales, and I wonder what your first inspiration was to get involved or interested in theatre. Was it a school show, for instance, or did you go and see theatre a lot?
Well, as you mentioned, my hometown is Llandudno. I was born there, and on my way home from school would often walk past with my mum the Punch and Judy booth. Punch and Judy being a long tradition at the seafront there, run by the Cogman family. And from those early memories of those slapstick comedy routines, little did I know that similar routines would have an impact on my life later when I got involved in pantomime. But Llandudno was known as a seaside variety town in the 60s, and I was fortunate to catch the embers, the glowing embers, the last elements of the seaside variety shows. Pure Pavilion Llandudno show, Headley Claxton's Gaytime was a regular there. The Arcadia Theatre held the Catlins shows. They also had a venue in Skegness. And the Alex Monroe shows in Happy Valley, the open air shows. So as a very early influence, my mum, who enjoyed the theatre, would take me usually during the school holidays. But my lasting memories really of the Catlins variety shows, where I remember seeing my earliest comedian seeing those Felix Bowness, who was the Fred Quilly, the jockey in Heidi High, Wyn Calvin, Prince of Welsh Laughter. He was another regular comic there. Norman Cayley, some of those really old seasoned variety performers who were also, I later discovered, seasoned pantomime performers. So yeah, while not involved in performing at that age, certainly the seed for a love of variety and some of those old music hall performers was certainly developed at a very young age.
What about panto? Do you remember the very first panto you went to see?
Yes, well, we moved to Swansea when I was about 9, and we moved in the winter, and I was taken to Swansea Grand to see what was my first pantomime, and that was Dick Whittington. I remember quite an exciting part of that show was skeletons coming into the audience. I didn't know until later years that was a well-known variety act called Dumart and Denzar, and their act Skeletons Alive. And also in that show was then a lower billing was Beric Kaler. Again, had no idea the impact he'd have on pantomime in his later career. But the star of the show was somebody called Johnny DeLittle, who I'd never heard of. Really, in those days, I didn't know who he was. I was quite young. But the Grand had a tradition of using recording artists as their principal boys. And Johnny DeLittle was a 60s recording star who changed his name and later had a really successful career as a singer called Heathmore. Very vivid memories of that show. And two particular things stand out to me, as well as the Skeletons Alive act. There were dancers in there, the Cherry Willoughby dancers, and they were the same dancers as I'd seen in my childhood in the Arcadia Theatre. The choreographer and her dancers worked in both venues. And amazing to think, when I look back on a handbill from those days, there were 12 dancers in the pantomime. how things have changed.
You're absolutely right. Things have certainly changed. Now, were you ever a performer? Because you obviously went on to study at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama. But what happened in between, seeing shows as a child and then going away to college?
Well, I had this interest in theatre, and it was quite unusual in the school that I went to, which incidentally I'm now governor of that school, that the arts weren't much of a thing other than singing. Coming from Wales, there's an assumption that we all sing, and because I've got a fairly rich voice, I was encouraged to join the school choir. I became a member of the County Youth Choir, and that led to me becoming a member of the County Youth Arts Company, quite a prestigious youth theatre company ever since the 70s. And I worked alongside people like Russell T Davis, who's a member of the company as well. Michael Sheen, he subsequently became a member of the company. I taught him there. So as a young performer, I was predominantly a vocalist, and was being encouraged to become an opera singer. That was where people who taught me at the time, taught me singing, thought I should go. But the Welsh College of Music and Drama had a really good reputation. I thought that teaching might be something I'd have an aptitude for, and they had a teacher's course there. And I successfully got onto that programme, and concurrently with studying drama, I was also able to study voice. So throughout drama school, I was known as the drama student who sung.
And rather well by all accounts. But at that time, of course, many people would have been considering theatre careers, but would have been advised by teachers or parents that they should get other qualifications to enable them to do other things, because, of course, theatre has always been seen as a rather precarious industry. Was that the discussion that you had? Because, of course, if you do get teaching qualifications, both theatre and education can be combined rather well.
Well, it wasn't so much a discussion at home, but it was certainly within school. It would seem to be the more respectable way that, yes, you'd go to drama school and have that in-depth training, but you would subsequently come out with a teaching qualification that would be something, an expression I hate, to fall back on. I don't think teaching is something you should fall back on. I think it's something you need to have a passion for, and I'm fortunate that in the career I've had some success in the education, but also through my training within drama college and subsequently as a singer, have also undertaken professional work as well. So it's a tradition of singers from Wales, actors from Wales, but certainly teachers from Wales as well.
Yeah, and I think it's true to say, isn't it, that there are very few careers that you can actually combine with working in the theatre in any way. But education is one of those where you can have careers at the highest level in both, and they complement each other in so many ways. After all, there's an awful lot of education in theatre, even panto for the audience, and there's an awful lot of entertainment in a good teacher.
That's right. I remember working on a dance project with a choreographer called Stuart Hops, and we were having this discussion about teachers being actors, and he gave me some very good early advice. He said, no, the best teachers aren't actors, they're just honest. And I thought that was a really interesting way to present yourself to a class, as just being truthful. And of course the best actors are also truthful.
You're absolutely right. Now, somewhere in there, obviously your love of variety, music hall, pantomime and everything else led you to become a Butlins redcoat, didn't it?
The way that my course was constructed at college, there was a gap between the drama school element and then moving to another course where you had the teaching qualification. And there was this window of 3 months that some people went off and worked, and I took it as an opportunity to audition, and I worked for the Butlins Hotels. And again, that was a really interesting learning curve. There were redcoat shows, they had nobody who had an eye on them, so I became the person that constructed the show that then became the show for that summer season. We had 2 shows, a variety show and a music hall show. So even as a recent drama school graduate, I had influence as a director on the company that I was working with then in the hotel in Margate. So yeah, it was a very interesting, and again, the opportunity to see some seasoned variety performers doing their cabaret spot. And that interesting link I mentioned, the jockey from Heidi High, the Webb twins, the twins on Heidi High, they were a regular act that came to us. And they were the first persons I ever heard singing the song Nessun Dorma, but particularly strangely, they sang it as a duet. It's all been an intertwined theatre, education, performance career, really.
You learn a lot, don't you, as a Butlins Redcoat, whether that be as a performer or a teacher. It's quite an apprenticeship in a way, isn't it?
Very much so. It's that whole thing of managing people in spaces, organising events, keeping people happy. It's also having that emotional intelligence to know when to go into a situation, when to come out of a situation. Judge your audience, in a sense, is a very similar thing. Within comedy, directing comedy routines, having that ear for how an audience is responding, how to move a joke on, is very similar to handling the general public in many ways, of just learning to listen.
So when did you first start to really take a major interest in directing shows? Not necessarily professionally, but where did that all begin?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was a member of the Western Morgan Youth Theatre Company, and subsequently was invited by the drama advisor Godfrey Evans to come in and work alongside him on courses, and he would often see an ability in people that he felt would be worth nurturing, and he invited me to work alongside him as director. Subsequently, I directed shows on my own with the company, and my work there led to subsequently setting up a drama department in quite a large college in Wales. It became the go-to college, really. Catherine Jenkins is one of our students within the department. Joanna Page from Gavin and Stacey. It was the go-to place for West Wales, really. And within my work there, developed that tradition of musicals, plays, and that work became known then outside of the education context. There's a very successful pantomime company in South Wales that's Llanelli based, and for many, many years they had a comedian in it who was Clubland Comedian of the Year called Denny Tupp. And Denny had seen my production work for college and for youth theatre, and he invited me to come in and direct their pantomime. It was a paid role, it was something they've always done and still do. Paid director, paid choreographer, paid musical director. And they worked to an incredibly high standard. And having directed them for a number of years, I was then spotted by somebody else who encouraged me to apply for a scholarship, an apprenticeship in pantomime directing. The first one in Wales, possibly the first one in Britain, where I worked alongside a very seasoned theatre director called John David, who directed West End stuff, and he worked for a pantomime producer called Ian Liston, who was responsible for the Hiss and Boo Company, who'd recently had the contract for Newport. And so Ian invited me to become part of this apprenticeship scheme. I worked alongside John, and then for a couple of years later, I was then the director in Newport. So it was a fairly smooth transition through being spotted within an education context to within an amateur context, and then the nature of that work leading me on then to work as a professional pantomime director.
Now, in terms of the other directing that you did, a lot of successful musicals, commercial musicals like The Boyfriend Oliver, Guys and Dolls, some demanding Sondheim, Into the Woods, things like that. But I wonder, when you first directed panto, how different was it as an experience directing panto compared to plays or musical theatre? One
of the things I've always been fortunate with, even in that Noda group and somebody like Denny, was people who knew the business. They would know how to set up a gag. If you say, we need a filler here, I know what we can do the echo routine, or we can do the I'm not here routine. So people would instinctively be developing stuff, and I, in truth, was learning from them as well. But they had the confidence in me because I knew how to shape things. I can work very quickly. Working on new theatre courses, you'd often put up a major musical, such as the Sondheim, within remarkably a fortnight. Within pantomime, as you know, in the professional industry, we've often got 10 days. So that structuring things very quickly suited an amateur context because they only rehearse part-time, but certainly suited the professional context where you have an ability to see the beginning from the end. You know the standard you're aspiring to, you know that it's got to be ready by the dress, and you just work incrementally and quickly to get to that stage. But pantomime, of course, is something, and comedy and variety is something I'd watched forever. So it was a fairly instinctive way of working. And I particularly enjoy working comedy. And of course, having trained as a singer, I was also equipped to teach the delivery of songs and to stage songs. Within drama school, I also studied some dance, so musical theatre staging was something that was familiar to me, and all those elements come together in putting a pantomime, directing comedy, directing, working together with choreographer and directing musical theatre, type numbers, pathos. They're all things I had in the toolkit, really. And I've been fortunate that a number of producers have given me opportunities to work in some stunning venues with some superb performers across the country. I still have now a career in both education and the arts, and still within the education context, people are intrigued by my involvement in theatre. And as a drama mentor for PGCE students, I'll sometimes reflect on constructing rehearsals, advising them how they can move forward in constructing the school play rehearsals. It's all intertwined, Martin.
It definitely is. And I mean, you received an Arts Council of Wales bursary to study pantomime directing. That's perhaps something that we could do more of in the future, do you think? I know there are other courses available now at Staffordshire University, that MA in pantomime performance, but I think there's an awful lot more that education could do in terms of pantomime, isn't it?
I think there is. There are a number of departments I discover as part of my work as a moderator for the University of Arts London will introduce pantomime within their curriculum, sometimes as an earner. They know it's something that will bring an audience in at Christmas. But I've discovered quite a number of people working in education that perhaps were previously performers that bring that experience to their classroom. But I think the whole notion of apprenticeships, we're hearing a lot of that at the moment, aren't we? Of, should apprenticeships be something we should focus on? We need plumbers, we need whatever. There is still a shortage. Within the theatre, there's a massive shortage of theatre technicians. And that's a way ahead. I was responsible at one point of working with Swansea Grand Theatre as part of my professional work in education, of working on some traineeships there, and two of their staff who were still there went through that traineeship programme where they were working but being trained remotely by the college coursework. We go in and observe, very much like I do with training teachers, because really pantomime of all skills is one of those on-the-job skills that you can only learn it by being a part of it, by watching, by giving it a go. And while I think I may be the only person that Wales gave that scholarship to, I certainly think there's opportunity, should people be bold enough to approach the Arts Council with a good idea, and linking, as I know Imagine are quite keen to do, linking in with education to give those opportunities where there are gaps that people can come in and shadow. It was very much a shadowing skill I did with John David, watching him scheduling rehearsals, watching how he'd have singing going in one room, dance in another room, and how it was all being worked slowly to come together by a run-through stage. So yes, I think there's merit in them. I certainly learned a lot. I knew quite a bit, but it was a way of consolidating that and giving credibility to what I did. And I think should people have that notion of, they'd like to do some training, they may be working but couldn't do a course full time or even afford a part-time university course. But by contacting a major producer in tandem perhaps with the Regional Arts Council, there may be some synergy there to work together.
You've worked in some of the most beautiful theatres as a panto director, and also you've seen different audience reactions and how much the show is local to that particular audience in Northern England, in Wales, and down in Reading as well. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, to study or at least take a look at audiences and see, how panto can be so different in different parts of the UK.
I remember I worked at Sunderland Empire, Blackpool Grand and the Rill Pavilion and put the same production into 3 places. In advance of that, it wasn't the whole stick and paste, this'll work there, is becoming aware of traditions that they're used to in that venue, doing that research of what works there. And most producers do have a regular face in their venues. So in Blackpool Grand, for instance, working with Steve Royal, Steve knows his audiences, and it's worth tuning in to those locals who can advise you on this sort of gag won't go there. We need to take, often you'd get the stories about the one-way system, and people were saying those lines in venues where there'd never been a one-way system. It's that whole tuning in to what is current and what is relevant. and producers being bold enough to allow the director to work creatively with their local people in the rehearsal room, tuning into the theatre staff, speaking to them about, what's current, what's the name of the high street, did you do this gag here last year, rather than assuming that what worked in Rhyl would work in Sunderland. You're absolutely right. I mean, Ken Dodd, for example, as I'm sure many people would know, he kept a diary of where he worked and what jokes worked where, in order to tune into those audiences best. I remember meeting Wyn Calvin, some of my research as a drama student, and he was saying he'd often alter his accent depending where he was. Yes, a Welsh performer, but if he worked in the North East, Wyn had a very convincing North East accent, having originally been an actor. And so he would even change his accent to resonate more closely with the theatre community, the audiences within that theatre community.
Now, your education work has been far-reaching as well, not just in terms of director of drama and head of year at various colleges and educational institutions, but also in terms of developing new teaching talent as well. And that's something that's really important. I think, to sum up both your role in theatre and education, it's all about communication, isn't it?
Very much so. It's about listening, having an ability to listen to people, and having that sort of sensitivity to tune into where they are and what will work where they are. So yes, I'm currently involved in teacher education for the University of Buckingham, and very interestingly, I work on a number of programmes. 2 students I've had this year are actually apprentice teachers, using that term again, where they're teachers in employment who are learning to be teachers on the job as an experienced teacher. I go in and assist their school-based mentor in guiding them on to perhaps how they could develop more appropriately for their setting, but equally how they can develop skills for when they're not in that setting. 2 students I've had this year have been in China, and all my mentoring has been done online, and that's been a really interesting development of my work, to listen in to a lesson, not actually in person, not witnessing the class, but to talk the teacher through what they did, why they did, and helping them shape their approach in a fairly remote way. And it was very interesting to see how those teachers developed their thinking through the year. And then a lot of other work is in person, in the drama studio, seeing young teachers, and because of the years of doing the job, of saying, have you thought about doing this? Or why are the children sitting down? Or why don't you bring them in at that point? Or what's the format to starting a lesson? Does it need to be absolutely the same every week? And just engaging people to be creative and reflective on their practice. And as a teacher of some years' experience now, it's really lovely to be in the position now of shaping the next generation of teachers.
Yeah, and your freelance work, both in the arts and in education as a consultant and so on, is ongoing. We've talked many times on this podcast about how pantomime always seemed to be almost a poor relation in theatre and performance. We had the Olivier's, we had all other awards, a lot of promotion. Pantomime probably employs more performers than any other area of the industry, and backstage crews as well. It was really important that the UK Pantomime Association Awards was launched, and of course your involvement in the UK Pantomime Association is another extension of what you do. When did you first get involved and why?
Well, it was during the COVID period, Martin, really. Sam Munday Webb was looking at redeveloping what had been a previous iteration of an awards scheme into something new. And the COVID period gave people time to reflect. Sam knew of my work as a teacher, as an educator, and as a theatre director. And there was quite a discussion about the awards and how we could find a measure, rather than people just coming out with opinions of, I like that show, or he's really funny. My background as an examiner was wanting to challenge, well, what were the elements that were funny? What was the things that we could score against, so we could have consistency across the nation, really? So what I began to develop, and Dr. Robert Marsden then took on further, was using that background of an educational rubric of examining, having criteria that you mark work against. And that was a really interesting challenge, because why is a routine funny? Why is that performer more convincing? And giving judges that vocabulary then came up with a more consistent and a more highly regarded, I think, approach to the awards element. But part of the thinking in those early discussions when a board of trustees was being established was, what more could we be doing? And there's already, as you'll be aware, Martin, been some seminars, on-stage discussion. Dr. Simon Sladen has done an on-stage event with Nigel Ellicott, another Swansea person, by the way. And we're shortly to do an event in September, being held in Oxford, which comes out of my work in Reading, really. Whereas company manager working there a couple of years ago, we had 2 relaxed performances. So I asked the theatre, what do you mean by that? In this theatre, what is that? And their relaxed performances were slightly different to what I'd done in other venues. So that discussion has gone back to the trustees, and Sam has come up with a day that's been held in Oxford in September, where there's a panel to share good practice on what is a good, an acceptable, an appropriate, relaxed performance. So again, that's a development of the work of the UK Pantomime Association, and there will be others that perhaps of a more, not just an entertainment basis, and the lovely evenings that the awards are, the celebratory elements, also that informative element of how can we make things better for our audiences in, as you quite rightly say, in what is a major employer, a major part of the theatre year. How can we as an association assist people in making progress in their work?
That Oxford event will be absolutely fascinating. A very good friend of mine, Annie Bannister, is one of the speakers there. She has 2 sons, one of them with complex needs, but she works tirelessly as an advocate for theatre, access and inclusion consultant as well, for both the arts and sports. That's going to be a fascinating event. Now, with pantomime in mind, I wonder what pantomime means to you personally, David, and why you think it might be so special.
I'm used to people saying one of the reasons they're big advocates of pantomime is just because it's children's first experience of theatre. I have a real problem with that, because it often is. But I see pantomime as being that initiation of other things that children can engage with. And so often, while theatres will say that, the reason we think it's important is their first link, there's very little between pantomime and pantomime that engages with young people of varying ages. Yes, there'll be some of the touring stuff that's got cop actors in skins, that's really important, another element. But what do you take an 11-year-old to? What do you take a 13-year-old to that will perpetuate that interest? So for me, I very much have seen it in my work. Yes, it might be something that's been a springboard. It's been my work to sort of bring young people on to see theatre as something they can engage with personally, as an audience member, as a creator, as a critic, as a career. Pantomime has been a springboard for a lot of my work. And it's my desire, and hopefully even through the Pantomime Association that we're helping some of that, is that pantomime is an introduction to theatres to engage young people more closely through their programming with theatrical activity. And in truth, if you look at the scheduling of most venues, there's very little you could take a young person to. I've recently done a project for 1,100 primary school children on stage at Swansea Grand Theatre to show them that it's a place they can come to. It's a place they can appear in. They work alongside technicians. They go to the box office. They perform in the evening. They see what a stage manager does. So for me, pantomime is part of my employment. It's part of my wider interests, my research interests, but it's also something that has initiated a lot of my work within an education context of trying to engage people with theatre beyond the once a year visit with the family to pantomime.
Hopefully things might be changing. There are an awful lot of touring shows for younger children, whether that be a David Williams or a Roald Dahl, or very popular children's books are being turned into stage performances now. And I think hopefully there's more outreach work and theatres are going into schools more than ever before. But there's still a lot to be done, isn't there?
I'm very much hoping so. It was particularly an issue when I was teaching 16 to 19-year-olds who could get deals to go to the cinema on a Wednesday, but would rarely get a deal to go to the theatre that was of a similar price. I work quite closely at Swansea to to broker a system with them where they could have last minute tickets, and where producers in advance were aware that we had a potential audience for them, where they would set a student rate that was affordable. So yes, there are for the younger element things I'm grateful to see developing. I have a heart for those not yet adult young people. What will keep them continually wanting to come back?
So do you have a favourite pantomime title, whether that's one you've directed or one you've just enjoyed watching in the audience?
Yeah, it would be Cinderella. There's a real reason for that. I mentioned Swansea Pantomime, my first one when I went to see all those years ago and we moved here. But the first time I ever stood on a stage and observed a pantomime from the wings was during the 70s. There was a Welsh legend, a Welsh performer called Ryan. He was Ryan Davis, but he was known by his first name Ryan. The most gifted performer, musician, actor, playwright, songwriter, harpist. And he was resident in Swansea Pantomime for 5 years. And during his first season there, it was Cinderella. I was invited by the guy playing buttons, somebody who I'm still friendly with, a well-known pantomime dame in more recent years called Des King. Des was part of a magic circle group that met in Swansea. He came along and I was a young magician there and invited me backstage to watch the show from the wings. And so I can still smell the scenery as I stood there Saturday by Saturday. The deal was, if I went to the theatre, he'd teach me a trick. If I could show him that trick next week, he'd show me another trick. And during that time, I got to watch some amazing performers, well-known Ugly Sister Act, Grand and Mars, watching them coming from the dressing room, having changed costume and another outrageous costume. Seeing Ryan working an audience like just no other comedian I've ever seen works an audience. And so Cinderella, I saw every Saturday during that Swansea season in 1972, when pantomime started there on Boxing Day and ran through to the second week of March. So Cinderella is one that I just love. And I've had the good fortune of directing in a number of venues. And this year I'm back in Reading working alongside Steve Bowden, and it's Cinderella again. So I'm really excited to be there, and particularly in that we're bringing the digital set that Imagine have for Cinderella to the Hexagon at Christmas.
That will be really exciting for the Hexagon audience. It's been well received so far in other venues. Exciting times. It's really important that pantomime moves on and continues to evolve. But at the same time, you know, some of the memories that you've talked about, some of the traditions, whether they be routines or, you know, elements of panto that have been the foundation for the genre over a century or so, it's really important they get passed on as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I love seeing young performers who have their understudy track given to them. They may be superb dancers, but part of the commitment is they may need to go on as buttons. They may need to go on and do one of the classic routines. And during understudy rehearsals, it's a really lovely opportunity to drill them through some of the mechanisms of some of those routines. And while things have in some contexts become digital and moved on, the heart of the simplicity of the silly routines remains the same. But we need to be teaching them. We need to be perpetuating them. And within the awards, as you mentioned earlier, there has been acknowledgement of bringing back some of those routines. I mentioned Reading again. Justin and Paul, as our regular comic and dame there, they had an award for the balloon routine. I saw that balloon routine in summer season in Llandudno in the 60s. So it's amazing to see people still laughing all those years on at simple things. You don't need the technology, you just need a big balloon.
Well, listen, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, David. Thank you so much for taking part. Have another fabulous season down in Reading this Christmas, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Martin. It's been lovely to chat to you.
And that's it for now. In the next episode, we'll be taking you along to a UK Pantomime Association discussion panel, taking a look in more detail at relaxed and accessible performances, talking about what they entail and why they're so important. So please remember to subscribe through your favourite podcast app and join me, Martin Ballard, next time for episode 89.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.